In this lecture, we're going to use CSS Grid in order to set up a grid that we're going to be able to reuse over and over again on our page. And let's start by adding some HTML here. So I will actually add now the next section that we're going to build, which is the How It Works section. So here we have the section hero, and then after that, but of course still in the main part of the page, we're going to have another section which is called section how, so which stands for how it works, basically. Okay, and now here I will simply add a couple of div elements just so I can show you the reusable grid that we're going to create in this lecture. So test one, let's just copy this, or actually let me show you an even better trick than copying it, which is using this command right here in the selection menu and then copy a line down. So this is something that I use all the time, and so I even created a special shortcut for it. But for you, the shortcut should probably be similar to this one here. So that is Alt or Option and then Shift and the arrow up key. But for copying down, it is Option or Alt, Shift, arrow down. So watch what happens when I click here. So basically it will simply duplicate this line. And so I do this a couple more times. And this is again something that I do all the time when working in VS Code. Okay, now let's just quickly style those. So something just temporary, which we will delete a bit later. And actually let's style the section how as well. So instead of just doing that later, I'm going to do that immediately here. And so that I will do down here, because of course we're going to need some additional code for this section. So I'm also copying here this comment so that we can create a nice additional code block here. So the How It Works section. And then here, let's add a padding. And I will do the same padding that I also used on the hero section. So 96 pixels on top and bottom, and then 0 on the sides. And for now, let's just give this some background color actually. Let's say orange, red. Okay, and now just giving those four also some background color, just so we see them. So I can say here first, or actually the nth child, and then the first one, background color, let's go with this one here. And now I will again use that shortcut to duplicate the line. So that is Shift, Option, and arrow key down. So number 2, 3, and 4. Here let's use blue, violet, and maybe some yellow color. Okay, just quickly checking it out. Oh, somehow that didn't work. Oh, and indeed, here we only have one section how. So of course I want to select the nth child of the div elements that are in there. So let's add that in all of these. Oh, that didn't work somehow. Ah, now that's better. Let me just give them some padding here. And this is temporary, so we can just use pixels. And also the font size of even something like 50 pixels. Okay, but now let's say that we wanted to arrange these four here in a 2x2 grid, for example. So how would we do that? Well, we could of course go back here to our section how and then set up that grid, right? However, we would then write that code maybe multiple times over and over again in different parts of our website. And so that's something that we want to avoid. And so instead, I will actually create a reusable grid. Okay, so that's the whole point of this lecture. And well, let's do it right here for now. So I will simply create a new class here, which I'm going to call grid. And then, of course, I will make it a grid container. And let's also add some gap here. Maybe, again, 9.6 RAM. And here, it needs actually to be RAM as well, of course, not pixel. And I said that I wanted a 2x2 grid. So that means 2 columns. So grid template columns. And so let's actually use the repeat function and then saying that we want 1fr twice. So remember that this is the exact same thing as writing 1fr, 1fr, right? Okay, and so this now we can add here, right? And so now the section how is also a grid, and so this code also applies now to this element. And so if we give this a save, then we should have our grid, and indeed, here it is, right? Okay, but this is actually not really reusable yet, because let's say that we have another section then. Let me just copy it here, why not? So now we have it twice here, and indeed, it's exactly the same thing. But let's say that this one here, I actually wanted it to have 3 columns. So what would we do then? So we cannot change this one because the first grid here, we still want it to be 2x2. Only this one here should have 3 columns, right? And so the way to make this really reusable is to basically export that style from the grid and create yet another class that we can then add here and here. So let me show that to you in practice. So grid. And then here I like, again, to use these 2 dashes to say that this is a variation of the original. So grid, 2 calls, which stands for 2 columns. And so here we will now add this code. Okay, and then we can copy it and say grid 3 columns. And then here we, of course, want to repeat this 3 times. So, can you see what we're going to do now? Well, now we just have to add grid 2 calls here to this class list. And then here, grid 3 calls. And so with this, we're going to achieve exactly what we wanted. Right? So our first grid is a 2x2, so with 2 columns. And the second one has 3 columns. Right? And so now our grid element here is way more versatile all over our page. So we can use it in different situations and then simply use this other variation class here basically to create a grid with 2 or 3 columns, or we might even need 4 columns. And so that is very easy as well. So let's say here we wanted actually 4. And so here we go. So now it is 4 columns. And we can, of course, also see that nicely in the dev tools, where we see, of course, or actually here, the parent, of course. So here we have the grid code applying. So the code from the grid class. So this one here. And then we have the grid 4 calls, of course. So this one here, which then makes it so that we have the 4 columns as we specified here. Right? And so this is a very nice technique to basically export these different styles into different classes in order to make them reusable across our page. Now, another thing that we might want to reuse a couple of times over our page is a centered container element, right? So that's something that we have used a couple of times in past projects and actually already also in our hero section, right? And so let's actually also export that into its own class like this. So a generic container, basically. Let me do that here. And a bit later, I will then, of course, move all of this code here to the generic section in our CSS file here. But now, let's create a container here. And so this container is going to be the element that we're always going to use in order to center the content on our page. So inside of the browser viewport, right? So as always, we need to define a width here. And we do that, again, using the max width property to make it nice and fluid. And here I'm going to go with 120 rem. So that's basically 1200 pixels. And that's kind of a standard, we might say. So that's something that many pages use. Another one is 1140 pixels. So this is somehow also some kind of convention that you can also use. And that's actually very similar to this 1200 pixels, which I really like to use. So basically with this here, we are now defining that most of the content on our page, which will live inside our container of this, will have this width here or less. So when the viewport is less than 1200 pixels, then of course the container will shrink down, right? Then we can center it also using margin set to 0 and auto. And remember that this auto here, basically what it does is to give the same margin to the left and right side, and it will be figured out automatically. And so since these two margin values are the same on both sides, it basically makes the content look as if it was centered, right? Okay, and now we can apply this once again, for example, here. Let's add it first, but the order doesn't matter, of course. So now this element here is going to be a container and a grid with two columns all at the same time. All right, and here you see it. And let's shrink it down. So all the way to 1200 pixels. And then, of course, it is shrinking down. Now here we still have those, because they come from down here, from these, which are a bit too big to fit this viewport. But here, actually, it is happening what should be happening. So everything is nicely shrinking, right? Now here we just have that problem that the content is all the way glued here to the left and the right side. And so we should probably add some padding to our container element here, just like we did actually right here in the hero, right? So there we added 3.2 pixels, or rem actually. So here, and so let's do the exact same thing here. Okay. So yeah, right here. And by doing this, we will basically subtract 32 pixels from both sides of our content. And so in the end, we will actually end up with something very similar of these 1140 pixels of width for the content. So that's because of the box model. So let me show you what I mean here. So yeah, so this is what I said. So we defined this box to be 1200 pixels wide, but then as I just mentioned, we basically subtract 32 pixels on both sides, and then we end up with these 1136, which is almost those 1140 pixels. Okay, and so now when we do this, then the content is no longer glued to the sides. Okay, however, usually when we have a background color on the section, we do want the background color to extend all the way to the sides, right? So exactly what we had also up here, right? And when I say background color, then the same might also be true for some kind of background image, right? And so what we need to do is to actually not add all of this here to this element, so to the section itself, but instead wrap all of this into yet another div element. And so this is the one with all these classes, right? So this one here is actually the container, the grid, and the grid with two columns. Well, now something is strange here. So let's inspect this. Oh, of course, it's because these selectors that we did here with the nth child are no longer working as expected. Because now this one here is actually the first child of this section, right? So this one here is now applying to the entire box. But, well, that's not really a problem anyway. So let's just remove those styles, since we do no longer need them actually anyway. So we can maybe just leave this here. And so now we want the div that is a child of the div of the section how. So that will then select these four here. We just give them some other random background color. Well, maybe not orange. Yeah, just like this. Okay, and so now we can nicely see how the background color extends all the way from the right to the left side here, all while keeping this in a nice container that keeps being centered, right? And then again, once the viewport shrinks, we then get this nice space right here. Okay, so that works beautifully. This one we no longer need. And, well, let's just keep them here for now, but we don't need them anymore as well. So deleting this style. And so these reusable classes, I will now put them up here. So in the reusables, and right at the very top, because we're going to use these ones all the time as we build the rest of the page. Okay, now just one more thing, which is that you might be wondering why we did not use this sort of container in our hero section. Because we actually did something a bit similar. So we have the section here, and then in there we have a container, which is a grid with two columns. So in this case, that is called hero, but it is very similar if we take a look at it. So yeah, right here. It has the margin, it has also the padding, and we also declare it as a grid with two columns, right? However, the big difference here is that the hero has a larger width. So the container that we defined has 120 rem, so 1200 pixels, and this one has 130 rem, so 1300 pixels, which means that it is 100 pixels wider. And of course, it wouldn't have to be like this. So we could have done the exact same width, but actually I like it visually better when the hero section is a little bit wider than the rest of the content. So let's check that out. And now it's not really so visible anymore because we took away the background colors, but you can still see that the container now starts here, but the hero section starts a little bit more here on the left, right? And so again, that's because this section is wider, right? So if it had the same width, and we can simply do that here, then of course, it would be nicely aligned with this one, right? So now this container starts here, as we can see by hovering over it, right? And then the other container now starts at the exact same thing. And again, that's because it has the same width. All right. But then this hero image here shrinks a little bit because as it has less space, of course, it needs to become smaller. And so I personally like it when this is bigger. Also here we now moved to 4 lines for this content, which of course we could fix by make the text smaller. But yeah, I think that especially on bigger screens, it looks better when this, when this hero section is a little bit bigger. So I can just increase this, and then you can see that this image here gets a lot bigger, and we get more space here as this increases. So 130, and yeah, I think that looks better. But of course, if later you build your own layouts and your own hero sections, and you have a different type of content, maybe you're building one of the headers that we built in the previous section, which simply had a background image and then some content, then of course it might be perfectly fine to simply have the same width on the entire page. And then you could reuse that container element also for this situation here. Okay, so I hope that made sense. And it is the reason why basically we built a special section, so a special container here just for this section alone. So the hero is many times a little bit different and a bit special, and so it's not a big deal to here not have the reusable code. But then from now on, we will use this grid that we just set up in all the sections that follow. Okay, so I hope that made sense to you and that you understand the logic behind basically dividing the functionality into these different classes. So container, grid, and this one here, and that you can incorporate this technique into your own coding in the future. And now what we're going to do next is to start building this how it works section. So stay tuned for that one.